Удобные исторические теории. Простые, стройные, известные каждому со школы. Будут опровергнуты. Забытая история.
The time is 3:06 p.m. On air is the program, Forgotten History. This is Vladimir Karpov speaking. Today, we are joined by Gleb Nosovsky, and we are discussing the Julian and Gregorian calendars. Here's a brief history. We all live according to the Gregorian calendar, while the Russian Orthodox Church and several others follow the Julian calendar. This occasionally causes confusion. When should Christmas be celebrated? When should Easter be celebrated? In general, many questions arise. Hello, Gleb Vladimirovich.
Hello.
What does the new chronology have to say about this?
I want to clarify that in Russia, we have only been living by the Gregorian calendar since 1917.
After a special decree by Vladimir Lenin.
Yes, because in Tsarist Russia, until 1917, we followed the Julian calendar. There were many attempts to switch to the Gregorian calendar, but Russian scientists were always against it and presented arguments, which I will briefly explain. Each time, this idea was rejected for scientific reasons. However, the Bolsheviks were not well-educated people, mostly dropout students. Lenin was a dropout, and so on. They switched to the Gregorian calendar with a single stroke.
So, are we starting with a sensational statement? In your opinion, the scientists in Tsarist Russia were right, and the Bolsheviks were wrong?
Let's sort this out.
Okay.
I'll start by explaining what the Gregorian calendar reform was. It is believed to have occurred in 1582, in the 16th century, at the papal court in Italy. European countries did not adopt it immediately. We shouldn't think that all of Europe quickly switched to this calendar right after 1582. Europe also transitioned very slowly. In the 17th and 18th centuries, different European countries switched at different times. Russia was the last to do so. Let's take a look at what this reform was all about. The Gregorian reform consisted of the following. 10 days were omitted from October 4, 1582, to October 15. That is, according to the papal decree, October 15 immediately followed October 4, 1582. Secondly, a rule for excluding leap years was introduced. Specifically, years divisible by 100 but not by 400 were to be considered regular years, not leap years. In other words, every 400 years, 3 centurial years would not be leap years. Accordingly, the year 1600 was a leap year, as it is divisible by 400 after the Gregorian reform. But 1700 was not a leap year, 1800 was not a leap year, and 1900 was not a leap year. So, today the difference between the two calendars is not 10 days but 13, due to these 3 additional days. The year 2000 did not fall under this rule and remained a leap year because it is divisible by 400. It is commonly believed that the goal of the Gregorian reform was to bring the length of the year closer to the correct length. People usually think that the Julian calendar did not account for the exact length of the year, whereas the Gregorian calendar is more accurate. This is a misconception because there are 2 natural definitions of the length of a year. One year is the period of Earth's orbit around the Sun, called the sidereal year, or simply the year, the period of Earth's revolution around the Sun, which relates to the motion of Earth as a physical point around the Sun. The second year is the so-called tropical year, which is not connected to Earth's orbit around the Sun but rather to the rotation of Earth's axis, specifically the tilt of Earth's axis relative to the plane of the ecliptic, which is the plane of Earth's orbit around the Sun. The tilt of Earth's axis determines the seasons. The seasons are not determined by Earth's position relative to the Sun, but by the tilt of Earth's axis, which dictates how much heat each hemisphere of the planet receives. So, these two periods, the time when Earth's axis returns to its original position and when Earth returns to its original position in space relative to the Sun, differ by a few minutes. This second year, called the tropical year, from the word tropics, associated with the tilt of Earth's axis, is slightly shorter than the usual year. As a result, the phenomenon known as the precession of the equinoxes has been known for a long time. In the old Julian calendar, the equinox occurred a few minutes earlier each year. As a result, in the Julian calendar, every 128 years the equinox shifted one day earlier. This is the theory. In the Julian calendar, there are 365 days in a regular year, with a leap year every 4 years, and this is a straightforward rule. The difference between the old Julian calendar and the new Gregorian calendar is that the Julian calendar, despite its simplicity, provided an average year length that was approximately in the middle of these two natural definitions of a year. In fact, even from the perspective of modern science, this optimal definition of the year was quite a contemporary solution. On one hand, it was simple, and on the other hand, it balanced between these two natural definitions of a year. The Gregorian calendar, however, shifts the year length towards the tropical year, moving away from the sidereal year. Now, let's figure out why this reform was introduced. Once again, the common opinion that we shifted from an inaccurate year length to the precise one is incorrect. Let's examine what considerations guided the authors of the Gregorian reform when they implemented it. Could it really be that the Pope, a religious figure, was so interested in the length of the tropical year, which is tied to agriculture, the start of planting seasons, and so on? Was the Pope really so concerned about the beginning of planting seasons that he decided to change the calendar? Naturally, the kinds of considerations given today as justification for the new style calendar were nowhere near the Pope's concerns. The Pope was focused on entirely different matters. He was concerned with aligning the date of the spring equinox with the date it fell on during the Council of Nicaea and with the Easter full moons associated with the celebration of Easter. Now, I'll first quote the papal bull, and then I'll explain what it means. The Pope wrote the following. In a special bull dated February 24, 1582, the following is stated. Therefore we took care not only that the vernal equinox returns on its former date, of which it has already deviated approximately 10 days since the Nicene Council, and so that the 14th day of the Paschal moon is given its rightful place, from which it is now distant 4 days and more, but also that there is founded a methodical and rational system which ensures, in the future, that the equinox and the 14th day of the moon do not move from their appropriate positions. So, let's break down the instructions and the goal that the Pope set in his bull. The Pope sets two objectives. First, to eliminate the precession of the equinoxes and fix the equinox in the calendar, making it permanently fall on March 21st. Because, the Pope says, when the fathers of the Council of Nicaea established the rules for Easter, the equinox was exactly on March 21st.
So far, everything seems quite logical.
Yes, it seems logical, but there are plenty of errors. In addition, the Pope mentions that at present, in the 16th century, the equinox had shifted by approximately 10 days. The second goal he sets is to stop the movement of the Easter cycle of spring full moons in the calendar. The fact is that the Christian Easter calculation uses a calendar cycle of Easter full moons, which allows determining the first spring full moon not by looking at the sky, but by consulting the calendar and tables. In the Julian calendar, this 19-year cycle of Easter full moons has an error of 1 day every 300 years. In other words, in the Julian calendar, the phase of the moon repeats every 19 years, but after 300 years, there is a 1-day shift in this period. So, this period is not exact but approximate. The Pope thus gave the task of halting this shift of the 19-year cycle in the calendar. In addition, in the same bull, he states that the difference between the calendar full moon and the real one is 4 or 5 days. Let me point out 2 significant errors in this bull. First, the difference between the full moons was not 4 or 5 days, but between 1 and 3 days, which can easily be calculated. That's the first error. Secondly, in the Gregorian calendar, the 19-year cycle of full moons wasn't stopped. Moreover, it actually started moving twice as fast, and in the opposite direction. So, in reality, this instruction was completely pointless. The goal set was poorly formulated and naturally was not achieved. In the end, the only result achieved through this reform was that the spring equinox was indeed fixed on March 21st. All of the Pope's other directives simply were not carried out because they couldn't be. They were poorly formulated. Of course, this wasn't done by the Pope himself, but by his astronomical advisors, one of whom was thought to be a certain doctor, Luigi Lilio. Actually, all this was calculated by a physician. Now, let's look at why the equinox had to be set specifically on March 21st, not on the 1st, not the 15th, but exactly the 21st. This is a very interesting question. We've written several books on this topic. One is called Easter, another is Counting Years from Christ and Calendar Controversies. Moreover, there's a large chapter on this subject in the book, Biblical Russia. The idea that the equinox was on March 21st at the time of the Council of Nicaea wasn't invented by the Pope. In the 16th century, this was a fairly widespread viewpoint. It was based on the fact that in the Old Orthodox Julian Paschalian, which is still used by the Orthodox Church, the earliest Easter fell on March 22nd. From this, it was traditionally concluded that since Easter cannot occur before the spring equinox or coincide with it, the equinox must have been on March 21st during the time of the Fathers of the Council of Nicaea. This conclusion was made by medieval scholastic scholars, but it is incorrect. If you closely examine the history of the Paschalian, you'll see the following. When the Fathers of the Council of Nicaea worked on this, March was not a solar month, but an old lunar one. The ancient calendar was lunar. Even today, the lunar calendar is still in use in some places. Why do we have about 30 days in a month? Because 29.5 days is the lunar month, the period between 2 new moons. The very word for month
is related to the moon.
Yes, from the word luna, moon, meaning month. And, naturally, it's well known that the original months were lunar. So, when March was lunar, it was the first month. What does first month mean? It means the month after the spring equinox, or more precisely, the middle of it after the spring equinox. In a lunar month, March 1st is the new moon, and the 14th or 15th is the full moon, depending on how you define the new moon, whether it's the middle point between the crescent disappearing and reappearing or the appearance of the new crescent. I won't dwell on this difference, as it's plus or minus 1 day. Depending on how you define the new moon, in the lunar month, the full moon will always fall on March 14th or 15th. Therefore, March 14th or 15th is the full moon. And according to the Orthodox Christian tradition, the Jewish Passover began during the first spring full moon and was celebrated for 7 days.
Right up until the 21st.
Exactly, right up until the 21st. According to the apostolic rules for Easter, the new Christian Easter had to be different from the Jewish one and not coincide with it. Otherwise, they would overlap. This is one of the main rules for Easter. Consequently, in this lunar March, the earliest date Christians could begin celebrating Easter was March 22nd. This is a simple and natural explanation derived from church history. But what happened? It's known that Christians followed this. They celebrated Easter according to the apostolic rules, which are only 2. The first is not to celebrate alongside the Jews, meaning no earlier than lunar March 22nd. The second is to celebrate after the spring equinox. Again, if March is lunar, then by definition its middle falls after the spring equinox. This is essentially the definition of lunar March. Therefore, starting from March 22nd, they could safely celebrate Easter, observing both apostolic rules. It's known that different Christians celebrated Easter at different times. This is also a well-known part of church history because these 2 apostolic rules did not precisely determine the date of Easter. They only imposed restrictions, no earlier than lunar March 22nd. As we know from church history, at the First Ecumenical Council, the Council of Nicaea, it was decided to establish a unified date for celebrating Easter for all Christians and to introduce calendar rules, so that all Christians would celebrate Easter simultaneously. To achieve this, 2 more rules were added to the apostolic ones, known as the third and fourth rules, according to which Easter was to be celebrated only on a Sunday. Initially, this rule did not exist. And not just on any Sunday. The fourth rule specifies that it should be the first Sunday after Jewish Passover, after the first spring full moon. The addition of these 2 rules made the date of Easter definitive, and its calculation was made based on the calendar. By this time, the ancient lunar calendar had already been replaced by our Julian lunisolar calendar. The Easter tables were tied to this Julian calendar. Calculations were made in this calendar, and tables were drawn up, so that Easter would be celebrated in accordance with these 4 rules. It seems that at this stage, the fathers of the Council of Nicaea did not want to break the tradition of celebrating Easter after March 22nd, because people had already become accustomed to this tradition, even though it no longer made sense, as it related to the lunar March, while the current March was already completely different, lunisolar. In this new March, the tradition had no meaning, but evidently, people had grown so used to it that the fathers of the council kept this boundary, especially since it contradicted nothing. They retained this boundary, but at the same time, they relaxed the apostolic rule about not celebrating Easter with the Jews. The original understanding was to avoid celebrating at the same time as the 7-day Jewish Passover, but the fathers of the Council of Nicaea softened this rule and allowed that Christian Easter could overlap with this week, as long as it didn't coincide with the first day. They maintained this apostolic rule in a weaker sense, ensuring Easter did not align with the first day of Jewish Passover. As a result, the Orthodox Christian Paschalion emerged, which the Orthodox Church still uses today.
Now I'll try to briefly summarize. The situation looks as follows. Calendars are changing from the lunar to the lunisolar, and at the same time, we're trying to apply some ancient rules to this new calendar. As a result, we're trying to fix a specific day as the day of the equinox while still preserving the rules for celebrating Easter. This leads to a sort of mishmash, and in the end, what happens?
In fact, you've mixed up different events. At the Council of Nicaea, they were transitioning to a new calendar, specifically from the ancient lunar to the more modern lunisolar. But at this council, they did not fix the equinox to a specific date.
Yes, that was done later in the 16th century.
Exactly, it was done later. But why didn't they fix it? Because in reality, the shifting they were aware of only increased the gap between Jewish Passover and Orthodox Easter over time. Therefore, since the apostolic rules weren't being violated, they looked at it and thought, well, that's fine. And they did not fix the equinox. But in the 16th century, because the meaning of the March 21 to 22 boundary had been forgotten, the idea arose that this boundary had astronomical significance and that during the Council of Nicaea, the spring equinox had been precisely on the 21st. Due to this astronomical and chronological error, the calendar was changed. And, as I repeat once again, the calendar was altered in a completely incompetent manner. The papal bull contains several gross astronomical errors.
I'm interested in the outcome. Let's say I'm a secular person, and I find it convenient when the equinox falls on the same day every year. March 21st, October 21st, it seems clear. Even if a decision were made, which from my point of view might be more logical, that, for example, the new year starts on January 1st right after the longest night, and accordingly, the equinox falls on April 1st, I would probably be fine with that too. What changes for me?
Let me explain. In this case, it's not about convenience. Sure, it's convenient when the equinox falls on March 21st, just as it's convenient when it shifts by just one day every 128 years. That has never caused anyone any disasters or difficulties. It's not about that. It's about who sets the rules, who's in charge. You see, there are two calendar systems. What I'm saying is that from a purely scientific, formal point of view, the Gregorian calendar is based on incorrect reasoning and astronomical errors. Essentially, from a scientific point of view, it's no better than the Julian calendar. From a church perspective, it is certainly flawed. Because of the Gregorian calendar reform, the Catholic Easter sometimes coincides with the Jewish Passover, which violates the first apostolic rule. Therefore, from the standpoint of the Orthodox Church tradition, it is simply incorrect, and scientifically, it's no better than the old Julian calendar. Again, there are two definitions of the year. Either we take an average between the two, or we get closer to one. It's essentially the same.
Let me remind you, today we're joined by Gleb Nosovsky. We'll take a break for the news and return afterward to continue. It's 3:35 p.m. You're listening to the program Forgotten History. I'm Vladimir Karpov. Today we're joined by Gleb Nosovsky, a mathematician, associate professor at the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics at Moscow State University, and co-author of the new chronology concept. Today we're discussing the Julian and Gregorian calendars, which is better or worse. So far, it seems there's no real difference.
There's no scientific difference. Look, the Chinese celebrate their New Year. The Thais celebrate their New Year. The Iranians celebrate their New Year because they believe theirs is older than others. They respect their traditions. And we're told, let's cancel our supposedly incorrect calendar because it's wrong and replace it with the correct foreign one. That kind of demagoguery is false. I'm against that kind of demagoguery. The foreign one is actually more incorrect than ours. Scientifically, it's even slightly worse, though comparable. But from a church perspective, it is indeed incorrect.
I haven't really delved into the Julian calendar, but just to clarify, is it true that corrections were made once every 120 years?
No, that's not correct. The Julian calendar is smooth. There are no jumps. Every 4 years is a leap year, and that's it. You can check any astronomical program.
But won't the equinox keep drifting then?
Yes, the equinox will drift. So what? Scientists knew this in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. It didn't bother anyone. Makes sense? No one was bothered by it. And then suddenly, for some reason, it started to bother people.
But what about cycles, human cycles, like waking up at a certain time?
This has nothing to do with waking up at a certain time. It relates to the start of planting seasons. And they already fluctuate. Look, due to climate changes in the 20th century, they shifted by 2 weeks without any calendar changes. In fact, the rate of the vernal equinoxes shift in the Julian calendar was such that, for example, the start of planting season would shift by 1 month over 4,000 years.
But still, that's significant.
You think so?
I believe so.
I think none of this will last 4,000 years, or even 2.
Okay, what about your colleagues from the Sternberg Astronomical Institute at Moscow State University? Do they share your viewpoint?
What does the Astronomical Institute have to do with this? Some may share, some may not. What does this have to do with such high-level science of astronomy?
Well, we're discussing this from a scientific perspective.
From a scientific perspective, the simplest things, known even to Ptolemy, are taken from astronomy. Understand, all of this is very simple. It can be explained to anyone. You don't need advanced knowledge of distant galaxies for this. What is a year? What is a tropical year? These are simple, long-known things.
All right, regarding opinions, it seems to me that unification is more convenient. For example, when Lenin's decree introduced the metric system, that too was a departure from tradition. But it became somewhat more comfortable to coexist in the world, didn't it?
There are different views on this. We replaced our measures with others, and now we measure oil in American barrels. Again, this isn't the most important thing in people's lives. Yes, perhaps the metric system is better than a non-metric one. But the old one was more familiar. After all, humans are not machines. They have concepts of tradition, of things that are closer or more distant to them. Breaking tradition is quite a painful thing. You need to think through carefully before deciding whether it's worth breaking traditions for the sake of some ephemeral improvement or not. That's the first thing. Secondly, I repeat once more, this isn't about what is scientifically right or wrong. I say again, from a scientific point of view, either calendar could be chosen. They are roughly equivalent. Of course, there's a difference. I say again, take an astro simulation software, for example, the positions of the planets in the sky, and run it, setting the date to 1582. Run it day by day and go backward. You'll see that in October, you'll shift by 1 day, but the planets will suddenly jump. That is, they gradually shifted until then, and then suddenly they jump. What's wrong with the Gregorian calendar itself? It has a jump. Those 10 days didn't disappear. If we look into the past using the Gregorian calendar, it still jumps by 10 days in 1582. That jump exists. So, for historical or astronomical calculations, it's inconvenient. No one uses it, or at least they recalculate into it. In that sense, it's inconvenient. But for everyday life, there's not much of a difference. So, that's not what I want to discuss. I want to discuss the demagogic framing of the issue. We're told that you, Russians, before 1917 followed some incorrect calendar. And finally, in 1917, we taught you the right one. That framing is wrong. You see? It's wrong.
Andre writes, when is the correct time to celebrate Christmas? December 25th or January 7th?
In the Orthodox Church, it's celebrated on January 7th. That's because, according to the old Julian calendar used by the Orthodox Church, January 7th currently corresponds to December 25th.
We're listening to you. You might need headphones. Hello.
Good afternoon, Vladimir, and many thanks to your guest. He explained things very well. I'd like to add something important. It was in February 1582 that Antonio Passavino, a legate from the Pope, came to Ivan the Terrible, trying to persuade him to accept the union. Ivan the Terrible gave him a firm rejection. After that, they switched to the Gregorian calendar. And I want to clarify why, gentlemen. According to the revelation of John the theologian, the Antichrist will come first, not the Messiah, the Savior Christ, but specifically the Antichrist.
Thank you. That was Oleg sharing his thoughts. Would you like to comment?
We've talked in detail about the Antichrist in previous broadcasts. I don't think we need to repeat that here. I direct you to the recordings of our previous shows available online, where the Antichrist was thoroughly discussed. However, I want to say that, in any case, from a purely ecclesiastical point of view, according to church rules, the apostolic rules, and in comparison with the ecumenical council, the celebration of Orthodox Easter is more correct than the Catholic one. That's the first point. The Christian celebration of Easter was established by the apostles. They provided guidance. While they may not have set an exact date, they gave rules stating that this celebration should not coincide with the Jewish Passover. Catholic Easter can coincide with the Jewish Passover. Therefore, from a church standpoint, the Orthodox celebration of Easter is more correct. It's unquestionably more accurate. As for the celebration of Christmas, we celebrate it every year. Given that there are two different definitions of the year, opinions may vary. But I believe that for us, for Russians, it's completely unfounded to change our well-established calendar for one that, scientifically speaking, is no better, and from a religious standpoint, is even worse. I believe this was a mistake. For example, if we take a date from the 19th century from a Russian newspaper, it would be given after the Julian calendar. But now we've forgotten that it was after the Julian calendar and might assume it's the Gregorian calendar. This causes confusion, and we have to use double dates. In Russia, we had our own traditions, our own culture, and our own science. We lived perfectly well with our own calendar. Then we adopted a foreign one because it was considered better than ours. That's not good.
Gleb Vladimirovich, the paradox is that if we were to return to the Julian calendar now, it would once again be disruptive for us.
I'm not even discussing the idea of returning to the Julian calendar. However, if we did, for example, New Year's would fall during Christmastide. Why did Peter the Great move New Year's to January 1st? Because New Year's fell right on Christmastide, and that strengthened the holiday. But now, New Year's falls on the fast. You see? New Year's is supposed to be a celebration, but it falls on the fast. This is an issue for Orthodox Christians.
Hello, we're listening to you.
Hello. A calendar that accounts for a 400-year cycle, as well as leap years in different positions, is more preferable from a scientific point of view. Because when we start calculating, for example, the gravitational influence of the Moon and the Sun on certain Earth cycles, like monitoring the Earth's gravitational field using instruments, We take into account the adjustments made by the moon and the sun when registering the Earth's field.
So, the Gregorian calendar is more preferable for you?
Yes, it is preferable. It's not about the Christmastide but rather about the timekeeping system. Timekeeping is a precise science that requires taking all of these effects into account.
Thank you, understood.
You have a complete mess in your head. The calendar has nothing to do with observing gravitational fields. I repeat once again, from a scientific standpoint, both calendars are approximately equal, but the Julian calendar is preferable because it doesn't have jumps, whereas the Gregorian calendar does. If we calculate dates back into the past, we have to somehow account for this jump and deal with it specifically. The Julian calendar is simpler. And regarding the accuracy of defining the length of the year, the Julian calendar's averaging between two natural definitions of the year is no worse than the Gregorian calendar's approximation to the tropical year.
But there is still a shift. A whole month over 4,000 years. For those involved in serious astronomy, that seems like a significant shortcoming, right?
It has absolutely nothing to do with astronomy.
The cyclic nature of Earth's rotation is important.
A year later, the Earth will be in a different position. We will continue to shift.
Constantly shifting.
Due to the Gregorian calendar's approximation to the tropical year, we are shifting at twice the speed relative to the Earth's orbit around the Sun. So, while the equinox date stays more or less constant, but the position of the Earth relative to the stars after a year of orbiting the Sun shifts significantly, and at twice the speed.
Next caller, we're listening to you. Hello.
Hello. About Christmas. It always seemed strange to me to celebrate it on January 7th. It seems to me that the Catholics have it right on the 25th. The sun has turned. The days are getting longer. That's Christmas. We don't actually know the exact date. We're not celebrating Jesus Christ's birthday. There's no exact date for that. And tying it to the sun seems very appropriate to me. A new sun is born, light is born, goodness is born, Jesus is born. It seems right to me.
Thank you, accepted.
Well, we celebrate on the 25th, not the 21st of December.
Still, the days start getting longer.
The winter solstice isn't on December 25th, but on the 21st. Again, you are all mixed up. I understand, it's not an accusation. Calendar and astronomical issues aren't simple. People tend to live in the grip of certain misconceptions or simple ideas. There's the correct calendar, the incorrect calendar, the birth of the new sun, and so on. But in reality, these are all prejudices.
From that point of view, the Julian calendar is just another prejudice, which we abandoned in favor of a different one.
No, the Julian calendar is just a calendar. The prejudice lies in attributing correctness to one calendar over another from a scientific point of view.
Let's take the next call. Hello, you're on the air.
Hello, my name is Igor. I have a thought. Couldn't we just standardize the entire year? For example, 13 months would make 365 days. Again, 13 months of 28 days. It would be convenient for counting weeks, and the days wouldn't shift around the weeks back and forth. Thanks.
Thank you. Accepted.
Yes, anything is possible. There are many different proposed calendar systems. But you have to understand that human society is accustomed to certain things, and our history is tied to that. If we were to forget about our past and only look to the future, we could implement any calendar, even one like you mentioned. It might even be much better than both the Julian and Gregorian calendars. But keep in mind, we don't only have a future, we also have a past. In the past, people already used certain systems. If we were to implement such a calendar, we would forget our past and disconnect from what people used before. The advantage, which is actually quite ephemeral, that we might gain from introducing such a calendar, would it really be worth the increased difficulty in understanding the past?
After the revolution, there were indeed attempts to standardize the calendar, to revise it, make it more precise. As an experiment, weeks were introduced that weren't 7 days long.
They were 10 days long.
Exactly. They seriously considered these changes back then, discarding the past.
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
They followed in the footsteps of the French Revolution.
Exactly, it was a rejection of the past.
Next caller, you're on the air. Hello.
Hello, I may have joined late. My name is Roman. Can you tell me if your guest has already talked about Omar Khayyam's calendar? They say it's the most accurate.
Thank you, accepted. No, we haven't mentioned Omar Khayyam.
There are many different calendars with varying degrees of accuracy. Since there are two definitions of the year, there is no single definition of the most accurate calendar. If there were only one definition of the year, then we could definitively say that one calendar is more accurate than another because its average year length is closer to the true length. But since there are two different types of years, the period of the Earth's orbit around the Sun and the tropical year, which differ by a few minutes, there is no theoretical definition for the most accurate calendar.
Let's take another call. Hello, you're on the air.
Good afternoon. I agree with your guest that according to the Orthodox Julian calendar, we celebrate Christmas on January 7th by the Gregorian calendar. If we stick not to the secular calendar invented by the Bolsheviks in 1918, but to the Julian calendar, everything will be in order. So, what do we have first? Christmas, right?
Yes, and then New Year.
And then New Year. It's the same with Protestants. I've lived in Estonia all my life, and there, Christmas is on December 25th. Even though it may not be correct, that's how it is. And then New Year.
Yes, of course, that's more convenient.
Also, over 1,000 years ago, or maybe more, there was Saint Boniface of Tarsus, to whom the Russian Orthodox Church prays for deliverance from drunkenness and alcoholism. Strangely enough, our truly smart but evil Bolsheviks arranged things so that we have the last week of the fast, and the Orthodox have to endure a little longer before Christmas begins. But they made this day a time of widespread drinking, alcoholism, and debauchery. That's all there is to it.
I don't think the Bolsheviks did this consciously. But the main inconvenience isn't the switch to the Gregorian calendar, but rather the fact that secular society lives by one calendar and the religious community by another. This mismatch is the source of most of the inconveniences.
Yes, but again, the church calendar cannot be changed without violating the apostolic rules.
Let's recall the beginning of the Soviet era. Even the church tried to switch to the Gregorian calendar back then, but the public resisted.
Do you know the details of this? Indeed, after the revolution, the church did attempt to switch to the Gregorian calendar. For a year or two, churches were empty during holidays, and they reverted back.
We're listening to you now. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, you're on the air. Please go ahead.
I'd like to ask a question.
You're already asking it. You're on the air.
Thank you. My name is Igor. I'd like to ask your guest about calendars. How can you explain the biological fact that the female cycle aligns with the lunar calendar?
Thank you, accepted.
I don't have an answer to that.
We're listening to you now. Hello.
Hello. In my opinion, the most reasonable thing would be to set Christmas on December 31st. It would be great. We could celebrate Christmas on the night of December 30th to 31, the fast would end, and then from December 31st to January 1st, we'd have New Year's, and everyone would be happy.
Yes, thank you.
By the way, in ancient times, there were different New Year starts. Today we begin on January 1st. The old Orthodox Church year began on September 1st after the Julian calendar. There were Annunciation years starting on March 21st. There was March 1st. In some places, the New Year even started on December 25th. That is, New Year was celebrated exactly as you propose. That was the case.
Take note, Gleb Vladimirovich. The desire to reform lives in our people. The drive to make things more convenient and comfortable, in a way we invent. We're listening to you. Hello.
Hello, this is Andrei from Korolyov.
Andrei, go ahead.
I wanted to ask something. There's a second, which is defined by a certain number of oscillations of a cesium atom and so on. It's a fixed thing, we agreed upon it. Then there's the calendar, which we also agreed upon. There are many calendars different people have agreed upon. So, time is more of a psychological concept, not a physical one. In exact sciences, simultaneity matters, whether events happened at the same time or one before the other, but everything else is irrelevant.
You're absolutely right, but right now we're not discussing the scientific aspect, but more of a demagogical one. I repeat, my main point is to show that the Gregorian calendar reform is based on errors, specifically chronological errors. Understand, the fact that they calculated March 21st as the day of the vernal equinox at the time of the Council of Nicaea is not just a harmless mistake. After that, they calculated the dating of the Council of Nicaea.
So, time is also a political concept, not just a psychological one. December 21st marks the worst of the longest night.
I really want to say one thing. There's a demagogical aspect. We are convinced that everything you had was wrong, and finally, foreigners taught you what is right. We've got used to this idea and now believe it. That's the demagogical aspect, but there's also a purely scientific and chronological aspect. Once again, during the Gregorian calendar reform, they publicly declared that March 21st was the day of the vernal equinox during the time of the Council of Nicaea. This is no simple statement, because if March 21st was the day of the vernal equinox during the Council of Nicaea, it's easy to calculate that the Council of Nicaea was in the 4th century, as is commonly believed today. But understand, the dating of the Council of Nicaea is based on this erroneous assumption, which I've explained and which can easily be disproven. It's well known that the Council of Nicaea established the Paschalion, including the rule not to celebrate Easter with the Jews. If we look at the 4th century, when the Council of Nicaea supposedly established the Paschalion, what do we see? That these apostolic and paschal rules, and in general the rules about Easter, which formed the basis of the Orthodox Paschalion, allegedly established in 325, were grossly violated in 316, 319, 323, 343, 347, 367, 374, 394, and 326. So, if you believe this version, it turns out that the paschal rules adopted at the Council of Nicaea were immediately grossly violated. This is nonsense.
Let me remind you, today we had Gleb Nosovsky, mathematician, associate professor of the Department of Mechanics and Mathematics at Moscow State University, and co-author of the new chronology concept. Thank you, Gleb Vladimirovich, please come again.
Thank you.